Welcome to this series of videos where I'm going to read a book in reconstructed Attic pronunciation. The purpose of this series is, first and foremost, to demonstrate adherence to the pitch accent of Classical Greek as we know it. Pitch accent is a very important part of Classical Greek's phonology, and there are a lot of good readings online using the reconstructed Attic pronunciation that are excellent in every other aspect, but I feel we could use more freely available resources that demonstrate the pitch accent. The book A Greek Boy at Home is a beginner's reader written by W.H.D. Rouse. It was originally published in 1909, so it's in the public domain in most countries and thus freely available to most people. This is why I chose it over other more modern textbooks like Athenas de Thrasymachos or Reading Greek. It's also worth mentioning that Rouse was a pioneer of the so-called direct method, which is teaching Latin using Latin and teaching Classical Greek using Classical Greek. Now let's turn our attention to the second part of this video, which is an introduction to the pitch accent. Before we start, let me say that none of the following is original research. It's just a recap of the mainstream construction, and also a chance for me to start demonstrating the pitch accent with individual words. The pitch accent has a close relationship to vowel length, which is measured in an idealized unit called a mora. Short vowels are 1 mora, pretty straightforward. Long vowels and diphthongs are 2 morae, including the so-called long diphthongs. There are some exceptions when it comes to word final I and oi, and it depends on the morphology, which I will not go into details here. Now that we know what a mora is, the basic rule of Classical Greek pitch accent is very simple. Exactly 1 mora of a word can have a high pitch, and we call that mora accented, and all the others have low pitch. And depending on the length of the vowel that the mora is a part of, we have 3 different patterns of accent marking. If the acute accent falls on a short vowel, it simply means that the only mora of the vowel is accented. Here are some examples. You can see that I've written out all the morae of the words, with the accented mora marked with a red H. Ballo, xenos, galos, pilos, poly. If an acute falls on a long vowel or diphthong, that means the second mora is accented. And because the first mora still has the default low pitch, the pitch rises across the vowel. Examples: agora, ego, skene, bino, dudu, blyo, pos, baio, elauno, baideuo, oikoi, raidios. One thing to note that diacritics, including breath marks and accent marks, they always go on the second letter. This is purely an orthographic convention. Also note that most texts, including many textbooks, they don't mark the length of the vowels R, E, and U. So when you see one of them with an acute, you don't actually know if it is short with a simple high pitch or long with a rising pitch. Minimum pairs are relatively rare, but they do exist. One example: lycée, lycée. Finally, when you see a circumflex on a long vowel or diphthong, that means the first mora is accented. Since the second mora has the default low pitch, the pitch falls across the vowel. Examples: mikan, enai, alete, sitos, tudum, lye, pos, baides, autis, geuma, oikos, agorai, skenei, galoi. Finally, there's the grave accent. You will never find it in standalone words because it's actually a mutated form of the acute accent. The rule is, if an acute accent falls on the last vowel of a word, which is equivalent to saying that the word is accented on the final mora, and the word is followed by another non-enclitic word, the acute changes to a grave accent in writing. For example, the very first word of A Greek Boy at Home shows this phenomena. Ego menemi. In the word ego, the acute is turned into grave because it's followed by men. There are two opinions on the phonetic reality of the grave accent. One opinion is that this represents a middle pitch, somewhere between the low pitch and the high pitch. The other opinion is that the grave accent simply marks the loss of the original high pitch, so it's not distinguishable from the default low pitch. In my readings, you'll probably find that I alternate between these two, because on the one hand, I find it a bit hard to consistently produce a middle pitch, but on the other hand, it feels a bit stilted to pronounce a very long sequence of words, all with a grave accent, using the same low pitch. Another thing worth mentioning, if I add a pause after such a word, since the original phonetic environment that causes the high pitch to be lost is no longer there, the last mora reverts back to high pitch. So for example, in this very common phrase, 가대, if I add a pause after the 대, which some believe to be the correct way to read it, it will sound like 가대. We've so far dealt with words with exactly one accented mora, but words can also simply have no accent, like ho, 우, 에미, 뱀이. This is not necessarily an inherent property of the word itself, since some of them can appear in an accented form as well, like 우, 에미, 뱀이. I'll not go into the rules here, but you don't need the rules when reading, since you can always tell it from the spelling. A word can also have two accents. This can happen when a word is followed by an enclitic word, and in this case, the last mora can gain an accent. For example, anthropostis. Again, you can look up the rules if you like, but it's always indicated in spelling. Before we finish, let me also talk about my other idiosyncratic phonetic choices. Some of them I chose to sound more naturalistic, some of them simply because of my lack of phonetic aptitude. But whichever reason, I will always maintain the phonology of reconstructed Attic Greek, which is to say that I will always maintain the correct distinctions between the different phonemes, even if the exact values I use may be a little bit off. I pronounce zeta as the zd cluster, which is actually the majority opinion, although there is some evidence for an affricate z instead. So, zdeu. I use a slightly retracted sigma to sound more naturalistic. It's a small detail that probably can never be confirmed or refuted, but it is consistent with the modern Greek. I also voice my sigmas before another voice consonant, like esmen. There's some evidence for this, and it also happens in modern Greek. I also do this across word boundaries when they are closely linked, like tuzde. Finally, there's some dispute around how to pronounce a voiced stop consonant before aspiration, which can happen as a result of contraction. Some people think you should read it as a voiced aspirated stop, like in Sanskrit, and others think the aspiration is simply lost. I choose the latter. For example, the do, ho sequence simply becomes do. This may be considered a violation of my rule to always respect the phonology, but usually there are no minimum pairs, so I think it's okay. When it comes to vowels, the choices are made more out of my lack of phonetic aptitude. I make no high distinction between omicron and omega, even though it's very likely that omicron is higher than omega, and I probably won't be very precise with the exact height of either. Similarly, for the short front mid vowel epsilon, I won't be very precise with its height. But for the two long front mid vowels, I will always distinguish them by height, so e, but e. That's the end. ΤΕΛΟΣ. Hope you enjoyed this series.